To lead this panel, I'm really pleased to introduce Samantha Smith, the director of the Just Transition Center of the ITUC, who's based in Norway. She's had a varied career, starting out as a financial litigation attorney. She's worked in the offshore wind industry. She led the World Wildlife Fund's Arctic team. And most importantly, she is an alum of UC Berkeley. So go Bears, and we'll turn it over to Samantha.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here. I was very fired up by the speeches we heard this morning from our California, US, and global labor leaders. I'm supposed to give some opening remarks on just transition, but really I can't say much more than what has already been said and demonstrated from our friends here in California. As everybody knows, just transition is about all jobs. It's about all sectors. So it's not only about people working in fossil fuels, and it's not only about people building the renewable energy of the future. When we talk about just transition internationally, we'll use a lot of global labor speak. So we'll talk about decent jobs, but that's really just high road jobs. And we'll talk about ILO core standards, but that's really just the right to organize, right to freedom of speech, right to association, not union busting. So just bear with us if a few of us use some terminology you're not familiar with, because we really mean exactly the same things that we've been talking about today. I think instead of going into some of the technical stuff, I'll just tell a quick story. When I started in this work, I was working a lot with my sister Annabeth Skrede from the Norwegian unions. And we were trying to mobilize the Norwegian transport unions on a plan to cut transport emissions in the city of Oslo by 40% in 2.5 years, right? So it's like a huge ambitious plan. You'll hear more about it from Hans Christian. But Annabeth spent a lot of time with the transport workers, talking to them about just transition, what this was going to mean for them, and so on. And they really just had 3 questions. So the first question was, what are the new jobs? And the second question was, how are we going to access those jobs? How do we get those jobs? And the third question was, what does just transition mean for us or for particular groups of workers, like older workers, younger workers, people who are working on the technology side of transport? And everywhere that I at least go, those are the questions that working people have about climate action and about just transition. They want to know, what are the new jobs? How am I going to get them? What does this mean for my future of my family, my community? And what does just transition mean for me if I'm on the sharp, pointy end of a plant or mine closing down? So we have some pretty amazing speakers today who are in 2 panels. The first panel is going to be talking about coal phase out, or about the transformation of the power sector, or about the exemplary closure agreement for the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. And the second panel is going to be talking about other aspects of just transition. So Hans Christian Gabrielsen from the Norwegian Trade Union Confederation will talk about how do labor relations work in the Scandinavian labor paradise of Norway, but also about the hard task of transforming our state-owned oil and energy company, Equinor, formerly Statoil, to offshore wind. Irene Lanzinger from the BC Federation of Labor will talk about the process of getting the city of Vancouver to commit to just transition. And of course, Jeff Johnson, the president of the Washington State Labor Council, is going to tell us about their amazing work to build a coalition to drive through comprehensive climate policy. Let me start with our speakers now because they have a lot to say. So our first speaker is Gil McGowan. He's the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor. Gil has presided over a period of substantial growth in the Alberta Fed, but also over a very hard time for workers in Alberta during the oil price downturn. He and the Alberta Fed have driven a huge process of improvements for workers in Alberta, including a $15 minimum wage, pension reform, reforms to the labor code and employment standards, OC health and safety, and also leadership on climate action. Gil has recently been appointed to the Federal Task Force on Just Transition. Alberta was first out on just transition and coal phase out in Canada, but now there's a national target to phase out emissions from coal-fired power by 2030. And so Gil has also done the hard work of talking to people about the end of their jobs and what the future might bring. So Gil, I know you have this amazing track record as an Alberta labor leader, but I'm actually most interested in hearing about the work you did as a frontline leader and an organizer. And you went around the province, you talked to coal miners, you talked to utility workers, you talked to community leaders to prepare them for the coal phase out and lay the foundation for demands for just transition. So if you could just tell us what the conversations were. How did you do this?
Okay, thanks, Sam. Before I answer the question, I have a question for the people gathered here today. Before I answer Sam's question, I'm going to start with my own question. I'd like to know who I'm talking to. How many of you are from the labor movement? Okay, how many are academics? How many from the environmental movement? How many of you are not Canadians? Okay, I asked that question. It's a little bit facetious, I admit. I asked that question because most people feel nice. Most people like Canadians. They think we're nice, but they don't know much about us. So I'm gonna. So I'm just going to say a couple of words about my province. I'm from Alberta. It's a province of about 4 million people. And since its inception in 1905, it has been our country's energy province. Before the Second World War, what drove our economy was coal. And then after the Second World War, with the discovery of oil, we have emerged as one of the leading jurisdictions, not just in North America, but indeed in the world, in terms of oil and gas production. If you've heard of us recently, it's probably in the context of the oil sands, which is the third largest reserve of oil in the world. I mention all of this because context matters, and this energy wealth, and it is vast wealth for our province, has driven our economy for a very long time, and it also has implications for Canada's approach to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So just to put it in context from a worker perspective, and I think it's important that you understand how valuable these resources have been not only to our province, but to the people who I represent, which is about 200,000 unionized workers in our province, both in the public and private sector. But as a result of our energy wealth, we have, it's about 40% of our provincial GDP comes from oil and gas. At the height of the boom, before the international price of oil collapsed in about 2015, companies were investing north of $40 billion a year in new development in our province. And the oil sands in particular are unique among oil resources because they're very labor intensive, at least at the front end. To get the stuff out of the ground, you have to build these vast industrial complexes, and that creates work. The result is we have about 180,000 people directly employed in oil and gas, and those people are paid very well. In fact, average wages in Alberta are 20% higher than the Canadian average, and the result is that we have a very robust middle class. And I say all of this because it provides a context in which we have to operate for conversations about climate change and government policy to deal with it. Needless to say, it makes it difficult. Like a lot of other oil and gas producing jurisdictions in the world, we are something of a petrostate, and like many other petrostates, our governments have tended to be conservative. But in 2015, about 3 years ago, we shocked our province and perhaps even shocked ourselves by electing our province's first majority social democratic government, an NDP government. And we did that with the support of the labor movement. The NDP is actually formally affiliated with the labor movement. We see ourselves as partners, and we helped elect that government. And one of the first things they did was start working on what we described as a climate leadership plan. And basically, we ran on a platform of saying that we are an oil and gas producing jurisdiction, and we have an obligation to do our part to address the global climate crisis. So we introduced a climate leadership plan that had a economy-wide carbon tax. We introduced a cap on emissions from the oil sands. And then we did things like introduce new regulations to deal with things like fugitive methane emissions. Significantly from a labor point of view, when the government put that panel together to come up with these plans, we demanded that they have labor representation on that panel. We got it, and then we got a commitment to just transition. So this is a long way of getting to Sam's question, but we did, as part of that climate leadership plan, our government committed to phase out coal-fired power, which is a big deal for us because 50% of our power was generated by coal-fired plants before the announcement. We had 18 coal-fired units in the province that were fed by dedicated coal mines. And we committed to phase them out by 2030. At the time, it seemed like a long runway, but once we announced it, what we saw is that companies were falling over themselves to do it more quickly. And the result was that we weren't looking at just phasing out jobs once people had reached the end of their working lives, but we saw that the jobs were going to be lost much more quickly. So we wanted to avoid, first we wanted to make sure that our members were taken care of in this transition. And we also wanted to avoid employers using our members as pawns to push back against the government, which happens all the time, by the way. Self-interested industry people will look to angry workers and fearful workers to become parts of coalitions. We saw it in Australia, which contributed to the collapse of a Labour government because of their climate plans, and we wanted to avoid that. So we established a worker coalition of all the unions representing workers who were facing the prospect of losing their jobs as a result of the coal phase-out. So we had mine workers, we had plant workers, we had construction workers who built the plants and maintained them. We came together in a coalition. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. This was very difficult. You know, this morning Sharon was talking about how difficult it is to actually be the person to speak face to face to displaced workers. That's what I had to do for 2 years. And so we toured the coal communities. We met in town halls, in church basements, sometimes over kitchen tables, talking to our members about their fears and anxieties. And then we used those stories, those personal stories of loss and uncertainty and anxiety, and we tried to come up with suggestions for policies that would address those concerns and anxieties. And just to make a long story short, we came up with a package of policy proposals for the government to consider that dealt with income supports, so providing transitional income for people who are losing their jobs, training support, pension bridging, and then also worker voice. So on the income support side, we suggested that the government embrace this notion of just transition, and I just want to emphasize what we meant by that. You know, when we talk about just transition, we talk about worthy societal goals like addressing climate change. There are costs involved in that. And what we made it really clear that we don't think that the costs associated with addressing climate change, they should not be borne disproportionately by a single group of workers or single industries or single communities. If everyone's going to benefit, if we're doing this for the social benefit, the cost should be shared. And so that's why we thought it was justifiable to use public money to ease the transition for these workers. So income supports, we topped up their unemployment benefits. We got a commitment from our provincial government to do that. We got a commitment from the provincial government to provide retraining for workers and also credential recognition so that their credentials could be more portable. We also talked about a pension bridging program for people who are close to retirement. And then we also convinced the government to establish mandatory worksite joint employer worker committees to make sure that the worksite specific concerns and anxieties were addressed. And then finally, we also negotiated with the government to provide support to affected coal communities for local economic development, because the best replacement for a job is another job. And so we worked with municipalities to get money so they could develop economic plans that would help create jobs. There's a lot more to it, but I just want to say that for two things. First, this was not easy. The stories that we heard from the coal workers and their families, and we actually opened up our town hall meetings, not just to the workers, but also their families, they were heartrending. Because a lot of these workers had worked either in the mines or the plants, not just for years themselves, but they tended to be multi-generational. So they had deep roots. So people were concerned about losing their livelihoods. And I want to say that a lot of our power plants were built near the coal mines, and the coal mines tended to be in isolated communities. And so these weren't just any jobs; they were the best jobs in the communities. So people were afraid about a dramatic decline in their standard of living. They were afraid that they would never be able to get a job that paid like this again. They were afraid that they would have to leave the communities in which they had lived and their families had lived for generations. And many of them were inconsolable. And so we did a town hall tour, and then we convinced the minister who was responsible to join us on a second town hall tour so he could hear this stuff himself, which was actually a turning point because they had been dealing with it as sort of an academic issue, but when confronted with the real-life stories, it really lit a fire under them and moved us towards getting the government to agree to the transition plan that we eventually won. But I also want to say that, as the president of the Federation in Alberta and as the chair of our Coal Transition Coalition, I'm often invited to events like this to talk about what we did in terms of negotiating, and I call it political bargaining, right? It wasn't traditional bargaining, but we negotiated and we engaged in what I describe as political bargaining. I also often come to these events and people pat me on the back and say, great job, you did, but I want to make it really clear that our members are not happy about this. If given a choice, they would have kept their jobs. And the only way that we were able to bridge the gap and bring them along with us and stop them from being enlisted in the campaigns organized. And we had a coal association campaign from the employers who tried to stop this. The only way we were able to enlist them in our effort and make them is by making them partners in the negotiation of their own transition program. I want to emphasize that this is not something that can be handed down from above. If you want the workers to come along themselves, you have to treat them with dignity. You have to treat them with empathy. You have to provide them with opportunities to be authors of their own transition. And that was key, and it would have fallen apart otherwise. And then, and it was, I'm just going to say this final thing. Sorry. This was the easy part. Coal is the small part of our energy industry. Oil and gas is the bigger one. And one of the reasons we were able to bring our members along is because they were convinced by what was already happening around them that the phase out of coal was inevitable, and it would happen even without government action. It was already starting to happen because a lot of our power providers were making the transition from coal to natural gas for economic reasons. And so it was easier for us to convince our members that this was going to happen inevitably, and so the best thing for them would be to negotiate a good deal for themselves. This is not the same with oil and gas. In oil and gas jurisdictions like ours, oil and gas workers are still not convinced that the change is inevitable. So I'll just end there.
Okay. So thank you, Gil, and thanks also for your honesty about what it takes to get a transition, even just the coal transition, right? So thanks for that. So I'd like to introduce Comrade Sharon Modiba. Sharon is a senior research economist at the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa. NUMSA represents over 340,000 workers, is that right, Sharon? Mostly in energy, mines, manufacturing, and also transport. And Sharon's drive as a researcher is to improve the material conditions of the working class and the lives of ordinary South Africans. So Sharon, you made an incredibly long trip to join us. We really appreciate it. And just to give folks a little bit of the context for Sharon's remarks, the power sector in South Africa is 77% coal. And if you think that the jobs in Alberta associated with coal were the best jobs around, in South Africa, those mining and utility jobs, they support large numbers of people who are not working because you have very high structural employment, due in part to the apartheid regime. And the main provider of power in South Africa is a state-owned enterprise, Eskom, provides 95% of the power. And the government wants to green the power sector, but NUMSA and many other people feel that while they support that as a goal, they're not doing it in a way that's going to get a just transition for workers. So Sharon, maybe you could just start out, just tell us what NUMSA's policy on just transition is, and what is it that the government needs to do to get it right if they're going to add renewables or more renewables to the power mix?
Thank you very much, Sam. Greetings to all of you, comrades in academia, comrades in the labor movement. I'm gonna just leave a soul of myself because I've traveled 26 hours to be here. So I really have to leave something. So when I say Viva climate change, you say Viva too. So Viva labor in the climate transition, Viva. Viva. Viva labor movement, Viva. Viva! Viva solidarity in the working class, viva! Viva! Thank you very much. So Sam has actually captured what South Africa is in a very important way, because in South Africa, for you to even understand the policies that are taking place, you'd need to understand the historical background of our government and the apartheid regime. A majority of South Africans are living below a poverty line of 992, which is 66 US dollars. They are earning that a month. A majority of South Africans are poor with about unemployment rate of 27.7%. We are a country which is rich, abundant in mineral resources. This is our bread and butter, and we depend on these sectors. Coal being one of the sectors which is employing a majority of people, with Eskom, the utility power, the state-owned utility power, employing about 48,000 workers. Now, this just transition, according to workers, is viewed as something that will take away the jobs, as something that will turn those provinces that depend on coal as ghost towns. It will render those provinces as ghost towns. Now, it has become a very difficult selling point for the unions to even negotiate on that front. But that has not stopped us. Our NUMSA 2012 National Congress took a progressive view to adopt a socially owned renewable energy, and that's what we've been selling to the government. Now, we've been doing study tours and also engaging in platforms such as this to try and get an insight from delegates such as Comrade President Jill, to just get as to what is it that they've done to transform their system. Now, as you can see, many of the developed countries, you'd have middle class, you'd have a working force that is skilled, and which is not something that happens in the African diaspora. A majority of our workers are not skilled. A majority of our workers are not educated, and one working member would then support 10 family members back at home. So this is not even a choice for them, but it is a must for them to stay employed in those sectors. We are in support of a renewable energy. However, we think this renewable energy sector should be that which is socially owned. It should be that which communities have direct shares in and are in control of who comes in, who goes out, and what happens to the land in which the farms, the wind turbines, and the solar energy is being operated in. Currently, that situation has not happened. The government, because of individual members in government have shares in those through kickbacks and through corruption, we find that they've proceeded to sign, they've not developed good social plans to try and take along the community with, so that they can implement policies that would advance the livelihood of the working class. What they've done is that they've signed agreements. Currently, we've got about 99 renewable energy corporation operating in South Africa, with 27 which are now being signed by the government recently. In fact, there is a new policy which is now produced, the IRP, which was then released last week, which talks of, how money is going to be deployed and what investments are going to come in. But these investments have been coming in, but they've not done anything to benefit the working class. So that is the difficulty that we find ourselves in. Profits have been made in South Africa, investments come, but we've not benefited. But that has not stopped us. We try and organize in those sectors, but the new companies in the renewable sectors do not want to hear anything about unions. They do not like unions, and as a third world country, it becomes very difficult to even negotiate for our workers. You can clearly see that there is double standards. Our workers are not viewed as people that have rights in their own country, and this is done with the help of a democratically elected government. Now, a majority of South Africans are not happy about that. They view the ANC of Mandela as having had failed them as a nation. The ANC of Mandela is no longer doing what we thought it would do for us. But as a union, we keep on soldiering forward. We've opened research development groups of our unskilled laborers and workers who are in our unions to educate them first so that they can go back to community and understand this message. We've not stopped there. We are also looking for as much funding as we can so that we can go abroad to learn, and we can encourage labor unions all over the world to support our cause. Because whatever that happens in Africa usually starts in South Africa and then it moves. Now, everyone else is also looking at us to provide answers. But we're trying, of course, by all means to try and consolidate as much information and learn what this renewable energy would mean for us. And not only because of it is what the global nation has agreed to, but because of we've seen the bad impacts on our workers. The workers that live in the coal mines provinces, they are very sick. They cannot afford health care. The conditions of employment have not increased, have not been for the better. Their salaries are still the same. So what better ways is it to look at the technology and see if maybe it can also advance the lives of these workers? There needs to be policies which government push, and we're looking at those technologies being provided and being manufactured in South Africa. Localization would be one of the points that government can look at so that we can try and also sell this point. But it's not currently happening at the moment. Our workers, as I said, they are very sick. They've not benefited from the coal mines. It would be good for them to also learn a lot on what is happening from other countries. And one of our proposals is, of course, the localization, like I've said. And one of the other proposals is reskilling. Like everyone else, we think our workers can benefit if they are reskilled. And we just want the new renewable companies to also be open for discussion and to allow dialogue and not to be evasive when they are asked questions. They must be able to engage with us on these difficult questions that we ask. And also, we are also holding government responsible through parliamentary processes where we go engage on several occasions when there is submissions that need to be done. So we are engaging on that level, and we hope government can actually take our concerns very seriously. But from where we are standing, it is not an idea that the community and the working class are understanding, and there is still lots of work to be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, comrades. So we've had two speakers talk about the importance of mass education in unions and of mobilization around these issues. Now, I'd like to introduce Tom Dalzell. Tom is a bit of a legend. I was told about Tom long before I met him today, and about all the work that he's done at IBEW Local 1245. He's the business manager for the local, and it represents nearly 20,000 workers in the electric, utility, and related industries. He started work at the local in 1981 as a staff attorney, and when he was appointed to senior assistant business manager in 2001, he assumed overall responsibility for directing the union staff, while of course continuing to be directly involved in the union's contract negotiations. So Tom was appointed business manager by the board in 2006 and has been reelected most recently again in 2016. Tom, you were the lead negotiator for the unions for the closure agreement for Diablo Canyon, which is more or less a model for how you might close down a facility. So what was your top priority in negotiating that agreement, and what were the most important things about it?
The highest priority for Local 1245 was protecting the approximately 500 high-skill, high-wage workers that we represent there. But very quickly, because of the coalition building that went on, we became committed to a much broader set of issues as part of the just transition, not just for our members. Diablo Canyon is not closing because of decarbonization, obviously. There's no carbon, no greenhouse gases coming from it, but I think it's sort of the proximate cause of the RPS, caused by the RPS policy, where for a significant number of hours on a significant number of days, there's enough solar in California that the power coming from Diablo Canyon is not needed. And a nuclear power plant is not one that you can cycle on, cycle off. You can't just turn off the switch. It's going to keep generating. And so PG&E was finding itself having to pay utilities in neighboring states, in Nevada and Arizona, to take the electricity. And you don't stay in business very long when you're paying people to take your product. The PG&E's financial people and our economists saw a path of economic viability until the end of the current license with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2024, 2025, but not beyond that. But there was a hurdle that we had to get over in 2016, and that was licensing by the State Land Commission for the intake and outtake of the 2.5 billion gallons of ocean water that are used to cool the plant every day. So it was in no one's interest to shut Diablo Canyon down immediately. It produces 9% of California's electricity, one plant. A couple years earlier, the San Onofre plant, jointly owned by Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric, had to shut down very suddenly because of a turbine problem. And as a result of that shutdown, workers were out on the street, and there was a significant increase of carbon because the replacement power was from fossil fuel plants. Nobody wanted that. So we were able to put together a coalition of environmentalists, local communities, the building trades, and PG&E to look for just transition, not just for the workers, but also for the community and for the environment. Friends of the Earth was founded in the 1970s in San Luis Obispo with a single goal: shut down Diablo Canyon. And they came into this coalition understanding that Diablo Canyon would be kept open for 7 years until the end of the license. NRDC, Hunter, I think that Union of Concerned Scientists was in that original coalition. Do you remember? Yeah, I think so. All of the local communities that relied on Diablo Canyon for their tax base were all part of it. Local politicians, Senator Bill Monning, who was here today, this morning, represents that area. He was very involved. Assemblyman Jordan Cunningham was a Republican in that area. Betty Yee, who's the state controller, is on the Land Commission. Gavin Newsom, the next governor of the state of California, was on the Land Commission. So we had some big shot politicians involved, and we came up with 4 basic points on this. So just transition for the environment. There's an agreement that the replacement power that PG&E procures, when they lose that huge part of the load, would be carbon-free, not place more carbon into the atmosphere than Diablo Canyon did, and Diablo Canyon put none in. The community their losses were to be mitigated with $85 million, I think, to help them get through just transition for the community, losing a tax base. In terms of employees, and we'd been through this before. Between the late 90s and early 2000, California utilities divested themselves of almost all of their fossil fuel plants as part of deregulation 1.0, which became the Enron deregulation, which became a pretty spectacular failure. But we dealt with employee retention there. When smart meters came in, that was one of the very first stepping stones for a new green energy policy. We had 750 meter readers, and we provided a just transition for them over the course of 5 or 6 years, finding them other jobs within the utility. So what to do with our 500 high-skill, high-wage employees there? We wanted them to stay because everybody wanted to keep that plant running for the 7 years, no longer, but for those 7 years. And so we negotiated a 25% retention bonus where people would commit to stay first for a 3-year block and then a 4-year block and get a 25% premium for that. And that's roughly in line with what we had done in 1999 on the fossil fuel plants. Unlike the experience with the coal plants in Alberta and South Africa, which I completely understand, our members were expecting worse. They were afraid that the plant was going to be shut down in 17 and 18 with no state land commission license. And so all of a sudden to get another 7 years and to get another 25% a year times 7 years, that's another almost 2 years of salary. And so they were elated. I met with 6 different meetings starting at 5 in the morning at Diablo Canyon on the day that it was announced with the CEO and the COO of PG&E. And the first meeting we were a little worried, and every single meeting ended with ovations because of, if you were close to retirement and you were going to get another 25% a year, you just fell into a wheelbarrow of money right there. And for the younger workers, what we negotiated was an ability to transition into the decommissioning workforce. Once the plant stops producing energy, the fuel is still on site, and then you start the decommissioning process. Typically, that's done by contractors who come in, a completely different workforce, and we have a commitment that workers who wish to be retrained for the decommissioning jobs will be decommissioned. So it was an almost all-party agreement, and the New York Times called it the model that could be used for transitions in the electric industry. And then the clock struck 12, and the pumpkin, or the coach, turned back into a pumpkin. And we went before the California Public Utility Commission with what the New York Times had called a model agreement. And the commission said, no money for the community, no commitment on the no carbon replacement, and that's too much money for the workers. We are going to change the collective bargaining agreement and reduce that to 15%. So we then went to the legislature. Senator Monning and Assemblyman Cunningham co-authored a bill simply to direct the commission to adopt the party settlement. There are 120 legislators in California. A total of 4 voted against it. 3 in the Senate, 1 in the Assembly, and the bill is on the governor's desk. So I don't know whether we're riding a lovely coach or a pumpkin. But I do know how it's going to end, and even if it does not end well in this legislative session, I know that the next governor will sign it, and we will do it on an emergency basis. What we had was a willingness with people who for 30 years have been sworn enemies to pivot. That's a big buzzword at PG&E right now, to pivot. That means to forget what you've been doing for the last 30 years and do the opposite. We pivoted with them, and I believe that environmentalists largely support worker goals, and unions largely support environmental goals. But sometimes getting that together is difficult, but here it worked. So what was your question?
Okay, thank you, brother. So on that note, I want to thank our panelists because we need to call our second panel up here. I know people probably want to ask them questions, but they'll be around at least for a little while after the close of the panel. So I suggest that you call them to hear a bit more about their different experiences with Just Transition. So thank you, Gil, Comrade Sharon, thank you, Tom. And I'd like to welcome Hans Christian, Irene, and Jeff Johnson up to the panel. Thanks.